In section 4, we look at cloud service and deployment models by focusing on the cloud service model as well as the cloud application deployment model. Right, let's start by looking at the cloud service model. This diagram is the usual diagram that is used to introduce you to uh, the cloud service model. Is a typical cloud service model that clearly demonstrate uh, what the cloud provides. It's a layered model, as you can see. It reflects the shared responsibility between the consumer of the cloud services and the provider. When we say each responsibilities, we mean um, the entire infrastructure is provided in a layered structure, and each layer potentially either the consumer or the provider can be responsible. Um, uh, so the various cloud services will look at all these things. Let's start looking at the first layered architecture there, which is labeled on premises. Normally the organization or the customer is responsible for all layers from networking, storage, servers, virtualization, operating system, middleware, runtime data, and applications. Normally, when you use an application, you just use an application. That application deals with data, but for that application to run, it requires runtime, a runtime environment. For instance, if it's a Python program, you need Python together with the libraries, and of course, that then allow you to write Python programs that can manipulate data. But then when you talk of a Python interpreter that interprets Python instructions, they do require some level of middleware. Typical middleware examples are libraries. For instance, if you are doing a natural language processing, suppose you have a data consists of documents written in natural language, and your program is supposed to analyze them and extract information from the natural language data. Middleware example of middleware in that scenario is the the, the various libraries like natural language processing libraries that can be used by a Python program. So in some cases, the developer of the application may not necessarily be the one who develops middleware. Middleware include libraries and also binaries that you don't necessarily that Python will then require to do a natural language processing. And that runtime definitely and the middleware run on the operating system. So you usually want an operating system, and typical examples are Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. Most of you guys are familiar with Windows, and some of you with Mac, but maybe very few with Linux, and yet that's one of the best operating systems available. And of course, below the operating system, normally we can provide some virtualization. If cloud computing is to be realized, you need the cloud virtualization, and then you need servers, you need storage, as well as networking for your cloud to work. So you can actually have as a customer, as yourself a customer, implement the entire cloud stack. That's still cloud computing, because you can actually install your own cloud and you play around with it and you'll be responsible for all these things. But then when the proper cloud computing does involve a provider, so there is always a consumer and a provider, but so you would delegate. Apologies for the cars starting outside my window here. I hope you can still hear me despite the traffic, the cars starting there. So let's look at the infrastructure where you, you want to delegate the maintenance of infrastructure to a service provider. So this is where you give them responsibility for networking, storage, servers, and virtualization. And all you need to do is to manage the operating system. This is equivalent to have you install a virtual machine in for instance Amazon, and then Amazon is responsible for the rest. For the you start from operating system, you install your middleware, your Python and its libraries, and your Python programs, data, and so on, so on, right? But of course, where you have your own, you manage your own data, although you can use server, a database server, which is maintained by the service provider. Indeed, Amazon provide databases which you can use from. You can just create a database and then allow your programs to access that database. Um, so in that case, the provider is responsible for those lower four layers, and the subscriber or the customer is responsible for the five layers. This is infrastructure as a service. In other words, the service provider provide infrastructure on which you can run your own virtual machines. That's the, 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 that's the basic end of cloud computing. Amazon does provide that. You can have your virtual machines, and then you will be responsible for everything else that runs on that virtual machine. The next one is where you have platform of a service. This is where they provide the runtime. In other words, you don't need to worry about Python and all the libraries that are required in that Python. All you need is to be responsible for the applications and the data. So in that case, you have a platform. It can be a Python platform, it can be a Java platform where you have the runtime is Java and the middleware or the Java libraries required, and the rest of the infrastructure. So the responsibility here is more shifting towards the service provider, whereas in the infrastructure, the customer, you as a customer, may be responsible for more of the layers. But as we proceed to software as a service, you realize that the application and the data are all managed by the service provider. A typical example is Gmail. Gmail, we just go there and start sending emails and all that stuff. But the emails themselves are looked after by Google in Gmail. They are the ones that are responsible for the application. Even the application, they constantly maintain the Google application, and then the data and the rest of the layers. So in this case, the service provider is responsible for 100% or for almost all the layers. That's why we say it's software as a service. You just go there and start using the software, right? So that's the cloud service model. It's layered architecture based. Now let's look at the cloud application deployment model. Right, there are four ways in which a cloud may be deployed. Right. Mm. You may have your cloud as a private cloud where your organization create a cloud and run it themselves. You may have a public cloud where a service provider provide the public with a cloud where ordinary people can start using. Amazon does run a public cloud, and in other words, lots of organizations and clients can actually use that. So it's a public cloud. There's also a community cloud. Typical example is a, a particular organization or community like car manufacturers can create their own cloud and share information they need to share. There are other clouds like government departments in a country. They can create a cloud that is essentially government, right? It is then possible also to have a hybrid cloud, and I would think that Amazon AWS cloud is a hybrid cloud because it's possible for a community to run their own cloud within Amazon cloud. At the same time, a company can basically create their own private cloud within Amazon cloud, and obviously there is a public cloud as well. So this is the cloud application deployment model. Right, with that we come to the end of this section. Notice the difference between the cloud service model and the cloud deployment model.